Hello everybody, welcome back to the CCNA routing switching video series. In this video, we are going to have a look at the function of a wireless AP, and we're going to have a look at the role wireless access points play in today's networks. So, the first question you guys are probably asking yourselves, like you ask every video, is, okay, I've heard of this term before, but what is the function of an access point? So wireless AP just stands for wireless access point, and it allows a device to connect to the network wirelessly. Now, this is a huge benefit because we introduce mobility into our computer network instead of our devices being bound to one physical location. Our devices don't even need to have a network cable to connect to the network. They can connect wirelessly, and we can actually move around with our devices while still being on the network, still having access to network resources. And so this technology really did start the boom of the mobile devices like iPhones, tablets, laptops, etc. Those devices were designed to be mobile, and now we had a technology which can be used to allow them to be mobile. So an access point, even though it allows for devices to connect wirelessly to the network, it actually does have a connection back to an Ethernet switch. So when we looked at switches and MAC addressing, essentially we looked at how Ethernet is a protocol which defines for layer 2 communication. So Ethernet switches are switches which are built to understand the Ethernet protocol, use MAC addresses to allow devices in the same network to be able to communicate. What an access point does is that it allows devices to connect wirelessly, but essentially the data that those wireless devices are sending is still going to convert those to, let's say, Ethernet information, and that data is still going to be bridged back to the wired network. So an AP just bridges wireless to wired. Now what does this mean? When we talk about switches, we talked about how switches use a layer 2 protocol called Ethernet that defines the rules of communication. Now, as you probably guessed, that wireless uses a different layer 2 protocol to define the rules of how devices which connect to the same wireless network, how those devices can communicate. So in this case, there will be a different set of rules to define how my laptop can communicate with my wireless AP. This protocol is called 802.11. So, if a wireless device wants to communicate with a wired device, what do? Obviously, we know that that's allowed because we could be on a laptop and we could still connect to a server, which is wired. Or I could be on my laptop here and I can still connect or communicate with my computer, which is wired into our home hub, our home router. So the AP needs to be able to understand both Ethernet and 802.11, essentially because think of it, 802.11 on one side, Ethernet on the other side. And the reason being, this is very important, is so 802.11, it's a different set of rules to communicate with. Because of that, it uses different information to allow communication within a wireless network. And so this information, so 802.11 still uses MAC addresses, however, the actual information that's adding to this data is going to be in a different format. Because it's going to be in a different format, it's not going to be in the same format as, let's say, Ethernet is. Because of that, if we just took, let's say, data which is formatted with 802.11 information and send it over to a device with a wired connection to a switch, first of all, the switch isn't going to know where to send that device. So the data is not even going to get there. The switch isn't going to know where to send the data and how to reach that device. So the data is not even going to get there. Secondly, even if the data did get there, the wired device is not going to understand how to interpret that data because it doesn't understand that sort of format. Because that network card that connects that device to the switch is programmed to only understand Ethernet. So, because 802.11 uses a different, essentially, formatting than Ethernet does, the AP needs to have the ability to change 802.11 information into Ethernet and vice versa. So essentially what the AP does is that if it's going to be receiving wireless frames, it's going to be changing some information. We'll have a look at essentially what information is changing in a later video. It's going to be changing some information and it's going to be formatting that information into a format that Ethernet understands. It's going to send it to the switch which it connects to, and then that switches is then going to forward it to the wired device. So now that we know what APs do, how does an AP do its job? So wireless access points have antennas, and these antennas are used to generate and propagate an RF signal. They're also used to receive RF signals as well. All an RF signal is what we call a radio frequency signal. It's an electromagnetic wave that's generated at the radio frequency. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Probably two questions. What the hell is a electromagnetic wave? Or if you do understand what it is, you're probably thinking, the last time I read about this was back in high school. So let's talk a bit about the science about what a electromagnetic wave is. We don't need to drill too deep because, like I said, this is not a science lesson. This is a networking lesson. So, an electromagnetic wave is a wave that has an electric field and a magnetic field, hence the name electromagnetic. And one of the key characteristics of an electromagnetic wave is that it can travel through a vacuum such as space. An electromagnetic wave travels through the air by oscillating. So by oscillating, it means that the fields change direction. So the electric field will go up, down, up, down, up, down. The magnetic field will go left, right, left, right, left, right. If you search for electromagnetic waves on Google, then you can see loads of different diagrams and images, which is showing you how the fields change direction as the wave travels. And so this picture, again from Google Images, just shows the electromagnetic frequency. So as you can see, we've got radio waves near the bottom, microwaves, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet waves, X-rays, gamma rays, etc. Now, the reason why we chose radio waves for wireless communication, so two reasons. Radio waves, they're towards the bottom end of the electromagnetic spectrum, which means that they've got quite a low frequency. Now, frequency defines how often that wave goes up and down within 1 second. The higher the frequency, the more that wave appears in 1 second. So it goes up and down in 1 second, like example of this, but the shorter of a distance that wave can travel. Also, the second reason, so because radio waves have a lower frequency than, let's say, visible light or ultraviolet rays, even though they can travel for longer. Obviously, what you can do is that if you emit or electromagnetic wave at a higher frequency with a lot more power, it can still travel the same distance as a lower frequency wave. However, by emitting it with more power, it means that you could be essentially causing ionizing effects on the human body. So one of the reasons why we use radio waves is because research has shown that radio waves don't have a negative effect on the human body, meaning that they're safe to use. You have to understand that radio waves are essentially everywhere now. We're always exposed to radio waves, 4G, 5G, etc. in your house. So they're shown not to have an effect on the human body, which makes them safe to use. And also they are used to carry data through the air. So like I said before, RF signals can be used to carry ones and zeros, so data across the air. And wireless devices, they communicate using two frequency ranges, so 2.4 gigahertz and the 5 gigahertz frequency range. Now, why did we choose those frequency ranges? So the most important thing to remember is that these frequencies are reserved for wireless communication. Essentially, because they're reserved, it means that you can't use these ranges for anything other than wireless communication. And that's very important, because what you don't want to have is you don't want to have interference. So interference is when two devices are transmitting on the same frequency, which means that the receiver who's expecting to receive these frequencies doesn't understand what it's receiving. So essentially, the data that it's supposed to be receiving gets scrambled because we have these two devices speaking on the same frequency. So to break down this concept, think about it like this. We have two teachers talking to one student. If the two teachers are speaking the same language, let's say the same loudness, that student, he's not going to be able to receive any of the information that the teachers are trying to communicate. And it's also going to be muddled up. However, if you have two teachers, one speaks Spanish, one speaks English, then the student will be able to, let's say the student is an English speaking student, he's going to be able to understand, and some data is going to be able to get through, because he'll be able to pick up and distinctly identify which teacher is speaking English and be able to understand the data that that teacher is trying to communicate with him. And like I said before, the reason why it's important that we define frequency ranges used for wireless communication is so that every device knows what frequency to communicate wirelessly on. Think of it like this, is that when two people try to communicate, if they don't speak the same language, then they can't communicate. It's similar to with devices that we build. So when we build these tablets, iPhones, etc., we need to build them to understand certain frequencies so they can communicate. By setting out that 2.4 and 5 gigahertz are used for wireless communications, we can develop and manufacture our devices to be able to understand the 2.4 gigahertz range or the 5 gigahertz range, meaning that they already know these are the frequency ranges we're going to use to communicate with. So I know that I can communicate with any device across the world, whether that device is developed in China, in the US, in the UK. I know that standards say 2.4 and 5 gigahertz is what we use to communicate with, so I can communicate with any device wirelessly using those frequency ranges. And like I said before, it ensures that all vendors can work together, since there's already a set guideline, a set of regulations to define what frequencies are to be used. Now, going back to access points, a wireless AP generates an RF signal that travels through air. Now, it's important to understand is that as this RF signal travels through the air, it actually gets weaker. So as the RF signal moves away from the source, that signal gets weaker. So this is, again, as an example, when you're inside your house and let's say you're next to your home router, the wireless signal you're going to get is going to be relatively good because you're right next to your router. That's going to be where the signal's strongest at. If you were to go into your back garden, chances are you probably won't be able to connect to your Wi-Fi, because by the time that RF signal has traveled from your home router and traveled through objects, it's going to have lost its energy, it's going to have gotten weaker. That means that the signal is so weak that it can't actually be used to carry any data. Essentially, it's what we call an unintelligible signal, which means that that signal is useless. No data can be carried. You can't understand what data is being carried in that signal. So again, this is another very important point, that to communicate with a wireless access point, you need to be within a certain distance of the AP. So the role that the access point plays is that, think of it as like the switch for the wireless network. Two wireless devices, if they want to communicate, they can't communicate with each other directly. They still have to go through the access point. So the access point essentially manages the wireless network. It says, okay, Bob can speak now. Okay, now Brad can speak. It dictates which wireless device can communicate at which time. And even if two devices which are on the same wireless network want to communicate, they still have to go through the AP. And also, another role of the AP is that it allows for wired and wireless devices to communicate by bridging wired to wireless. So think of it like this: if Bob was sitting opposite Brad and started to whisper information to Brad, then Brad would have to come closer to Bob until he's within a certain range where he can then hear what Brad is saying. That's the same thing or same concept with an AP. An AP, it generates these RF signals at a certain power. So in theory, if you increase the power, it means that the RF signal can go further. However, there's limitations on what power you can use to generate an RF signal. So you can only generate an RF signal at a certain power or below, which means that RF signal can only travel so far before it starts to become weaker and it starts to essentially become useless. So as a prime example, in this case, we've got the access point here. As you can see, it's got a connection back to the switch. These lines are going to be the waves that the access point is generating. This is going to be the RF signal. So as you can see, the closer you are to the AP, the stronger the signal is. The further you are away, the weaker the signal is. In this case, Bob, he's got a wireless laptop. He's within range of the RF signal, so he's receiving a strong RF signal and he can communicate clearly with his AP. Bob then starts to move further and further and further away from the AP, up to the point where he cannot hear the RF signal. Essentially, the RF signal is very, very weak and he can't communicate with the AP because the signal is so weak it can't be used to carry any data. Another important point to make is that the further away you get from the access point, the slower data transfer is going to be. The reason being is because that signal is weaker, so because the signal is weaker, there's more chance that data can be dropped as you're traveling through the air. The stronger the signal, the higher the data transfer is. The weaker the signal, the lower the data transfer is. And again, the reason why that is because the signal is weaker, there's more chances of the data being dropped. Because there's more chances of data being dropped, it means that we have to send less data at one time to ensure that the data that we are sending does eventually get to the destination. So we will go in depth in a later video, but like I said before, an AP can generate an RF signal of a certain power. This is defined by guidelines, and we'll discuss in a later video why these guidelines are set. This video is just to introduce you to what an AP does and essentially how it does its job at a high level. So think of this as only being able to speak at a certain volume. If you're going to speak at a certain volume, it means that whereas our voice, as we're projecting it, is only going to be able to travel a certain distance. In concept, as the RF signal moves away from the source, the waves get larger, meaning that the energy it was generated with is spread out amongst the larger waves. As an example, here, this AP is generating this RF signal with a certain amount of power, a certain amount of energy. So when the waves are first generated, these waves are small. Think of it as like throwing a pebble into a pond. It's a ripple effect. As you throw a pebble into the pond, the waves that it makes in the water are first going to be very, very small. The waves get bigger until there's no more waves. Essentially, that's the same with an RF signal and with a wireless access point. At first, the waves it's generated are going to be small, essentially, so there's going to be less space or less distance that the energy is spread out. As the waves get larger and larger and larger, in this example, the energy that was originally used to generate the RF signal is going to be spread out over a larger distance until it gets to a point where the RF signal ceases to travel anymore because it doesn't have enough energy to travel that far. So there are two types of access points: autonomous access points, which operate independently and are used for small environment, as example, a house, a small office, and lightweight access points. With lightweight access points, the access point itself is dumbed down. Essentially, it's just a device used to generate and receive RF signals, as well as perform other basic functions. A lightweight access point is controlled by another device called a wireless LAN controller, which is the brain of the whole wireless network. And lightweight access points, they're very good for larger corporate environments. The reason being is because the APs can be controlled centrally by one device. So to begin with, autonomous APs, they operate as an independent unit. They operate individually. So think of this as an individual person with his own brain. Think of this as being a self-employed person who makes his own choices and for himself. So autonomous APs, they will generate and receive RF signals, but they're also responsible for bridging themselves, the wireless to the wired. And like I said, because they operate independently, if there's let's say a nearby AP in the next room, the autonomous AP is not even aware of that nearby access point. There's no communication going on when we have 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8, etc. A number of autonomous access points set up. There's no communication which goes on between the access point. The access point just knows about himself. Now, this is good for small environments. It's not good for large environments when we have hundreds of access points, because that means each one has to be configured individually. That means that, let's say, we have 2, 3, 4 rooms, and we have an AP in each room. That means if one of the APs in one of the rooms goes down, the surrounding APs, they won't automatically detect that the AP has gone down, and in turn, they won't automatically what's called cover for that black spot. So one of the advantages of having lightweight access points, because the lightweight access points are all controlled by one central device, the access points will communicate with that device, and so essentially that singular device is used to manage and control all of the lightweight access points. That means that any configuration changes that need to be done can be configured on the central device and pushed out to all the access points. That means if an access point goes down, the wireless LAN controller, which is the central device, is going to know about it. In turn, it means that for the wireless black spot, which is now caused by the access point going down, it can then turn up the power on the surrounding APs so that they can cover for the black spot, and so that wireless devices in that area can still have wireless connectivity. So autonomous access points is good, let's say, if you want to have an access point in your home, or good for small offices, but it's not really that good for large environments. Again, they've each got their positives and their drawbacks. So, because autonomous AP has to bridge wireless to wired, think of all access points, or in this case, this autonomous access point, as operating as a language translator. Essentially, what does a language translator do? Let's say that we have two people, one speaking English, one speaking Spanish. The translator will transform English to Spanish to English, and vice versa. Essentially, that's what access points need to do. Like I said before, is that we use a different layer protocol to communicate on a wireless network. We need to take that information, translate it into a format that Ethernet understands, so that we can then send that data onto the correct Ethernet device, and vice versa. If we have a wired device that wants to communicate with a wireless device, we need to take that data, the information that the wired device is sending, put into a format that the wireless device will understand, and send it over to the wireless device. So let's see an autonomous AP in action. In this case, the AP over here, again, is generating an RF signal. In this case, Bob wants to speak to Brad. Bob is a wireless client, Brad is a wired client. So he's got some data and he wants to send this data to Brad. The access point receives it. He says, okay, I understand both wireless communication and wired communication. I know that at this point I can't send this data over to Brad as is. Essentially, the layer 2 information is not in a format that Brad's going to understand, or better yet, it's not in a format that the switch will understand. So the switch over here is not in a format that the switch will understand. So what the access point is going to do is going to add the source and destination MAC address to the data, send that data over to the switch. Switch is going to know, okay, this data is destined to Brad because this is for the destination MAC address of BBBB, and send this data over to Brad. Now, it's important to understand that 802.11 it still communicates at layer 2 using MAC addresses. However, the actual format of the layer 2 information is in a different format. Essentially, the information that it's adding to the data is going to be different to the information that Ethernet would add to the data. So, all the access point does, it takes Bob's MAC address, it takes Brad's MAC address, it then puts that information into a format that Ethernet understands that Ethernet will use, and we are going to see this format once we dive deep into the Ethernet protocol and sends that data over to Brad. Lightweight access points. So the function of an autonomous access point is split between the AEP and a device called a wireless LAN controller. So we looked at a autonomous access point, how that's used to send and receive wireless signals, as well as a bridge wired to wireless. Lightweight access point its job is to send and receive RF signals. However, the actual bridging from wired to wireless is done by a device called the wireless LAN controller. This is known as what's called a split MAC architecture. The wireless LAN controller is responsible for bridging wireless to wired. The AP is responsible for sending and receiving RF signals. Now this, like I said before, this works very well for large enterprises, as the wireless LAN controller is used to control and configure each AP. Essentially, we can configure settings on the wireless LAN controller. It can then push those out to the access points. The wireless LAN controller has got visibility over every single AP, and can actually notify a network engineer once an access point goes down. And like I said, if there's any black spots in RF signal, it can then turn the power up on the neighboring access points to cover for that black spot. So like I said before, if a nearby AP goes down, then the wireless LAN controller can then tell the surrounding APs, hey guys, your buddy over there, well, he's dead. So there's an RF black spots there. Can you please turn up your power so that the RF signal travels further and we can provide wireless connectivity to the wireless devices that were previously using that dead access point. So essentially, think of it like this. The access points all work as a team, whereas the wireless LAN controller coordinating everything. The wireless LAN controller is like the manager, and the APs are like the workers. So let's see this lightweight access point in action. So again, Bob wants to communicate with Brad. It sends this data to the access point. So like I said, is that with wireless communication, like with Ethernet, all data is going to be sent to the access point first. Even if that data just needs to go to another wireless client, it's still sent to the access point. Now, the access point knows, okay, I'm very limited in my function, okay? Hands up. I know that I can send and receive RF signals, but what I cannot do is I'm not programmed to bridge wired to wireless. I don't know how to reach Brad, but I do know that my manager, the wireless LAN controller, he will know how to reach Brad. So I'm going to take this data, I'm going to send it over to the wireless LAN controller. Now you may be thinking, hey, hang on, if 802.11 uses a different frame format or a different format for the latent information than Ethernet, how does the data get from the AP to the wireless LAN controller? So the access point themselves, the lightweight access points, they form what's called a cap-up tunnel. Again, we'll get into this in a later video, but this cap-up tunnel allows them to allows them to tunnel this data through this tunnel to the wireless LAN controller without having to change any information about that data. So the wireless LAN controller receives this data and he says, okay, I know Bob wants to speak to Brad. I'm the brain of the wireless network. I need to convert this layer 2 information into a format that Brad understands. It's going to take the layer 2 information, it's going to strip it away, it's going to keep the MAC addresses, it's going to add the MAC addresses to the data, add all the other necessary Ethernet information, and then he's going to send this information over to Brad. Now Brad will receive that data. It could be an email, could be an instant message, etc. Could be a picture, could be a Word document, whatever it is. But Bob has received, so Brad has received that data which Bob intended for Brad to receive. And to be fair, that's all there is to it. So again, thank you for watching this video. I hope you have learned something. Please subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content like this. And like I always say, please share with as many people as possible so we can ensure and guarantee that everybody across the world is getting access to high quality IT content free of charge. Thank you very much.